have Stuart Neill. Stuart, many of you will know Stuart from the ICS. And I'm particularly pleased to have Stuart on the panel because the ICS is working on an excellent initiative called Shaping the Future, which I know the international group is also very much a supporter of.
Thanks, Mike. And God, it's depressing, isn't it? Well, hopefully I can provide a little bit of light. And it's interesting. I probably was here 10 years ago with a bunch of energy industry executives from around the world, and we were wargaming transition strategies. And this was before Trump, and we were identifying the rise of Duterte and Trump and Brexit and all this fragmentation of and moving away from the big tent Bretton Woods environments and understanding what that means for decarbonisation for the energy sector, which is where I come from. And then when we came into the shipping industry, and the board of ICS and Guy sitting here was very much driving this, we need to understand our place. You know, we're working very hard on the regulatory piece, and obviously working with the IMO in terms of how we as an industry operate. We COP in Glasgow launched a Just Transition Task Force to look at the people, because, you know, without people you're not going to do any transition and transformation. You need to start thinking about investing in people operating in a different environment, because you don't even have the trainers to train the people that you need, and that takes, you know, 12 years in terms of a cycle, and you need to engage people to start thinking about that. But then I think the other piece that we were really working on is the system effect. The industry's very good at talking about itself and worrying about what fuel's it going to use, because we've been using this bunker fuel, and are we going to use LNG, and are we going to use ammonia or methanol? And the reality is that we're an industry that has used the fuel that no one wanted, and therefore we weren't in a very difficult environment to get access to these fuels, and there was a global infrastructure evolved over time. But then understanding our place in that, because if the world is going to transition to new fuels, and it's an interesting thing about the if, because there's a lot of MOUs and a lot of statements out there, and we did some analysis. We actually asked the Tyndall Centre for Climate Research to look at these analogies, all these MOUs, what's actually happening underneath that. Only 4% have actually got FID. So the transition to new fuels is going to be slow. It's going to be different as well, because ultimately the starting point is probably going to be the Middle East, because they've got access to finance and an endowment of solar and technological innovation, and they have got the oil companies to do that. But there's a slow transition there, because, you know, we're all not sure what's happening. But also the recognition that shipping is a minor player. Now, the analysis we're looking at, shipping uses roughly about 4% of liquid fuels at the moment. It's not going to change much, because most of these liquid fuels are going to be used whether into the smelting industry, the steel industry, onshore operations, and all the governments that we're talking to around the world. And what you're seeing, you will not have a globally traded fuels market for probably about 15, 20 years. You're going to see bilateral relationships between countries understanding where their fuel security is coming from, and they're going to say, I'm doing a deal with you, and it's a friendly nation where I can trust, or I have some form of trust that I can get access to those fuels. But what we need to do as an industry is understand that, because we're not going to build the global infrastructure for ourselves. And, you know, we've read in the papers there's a company that's having to start doing that, a shipping company doing that, but that's, no, they've also recognized that it's not going to be for ships, it will be for other industries. So how do we think about this as an opportunity for us? Because fundamentally, the maritime sector transports cargo. So let's not get caught up so much on what fuels us, because those technologies will evolve. The regulatory piece will provide some certainty, and that obviously is a piece of work that they will work on. Then you look at how renewables evolved and transitioned. There were regulatory and metrics that put in place with a feed-in tariff that unlocked potential and drove down cost of development of technology, which then made it financially viable with support from governments. We don't have that for shipping, because we travel between countries. And then the other piece, which I think touches on the geopolitics as well, countries will be under more and more pressure to meet their nationally determined contributions. So they will want to maintain these liquid fuels for their high intensive industries and their emissions nationally. So shipping will not only struggle to get access to a market where they've not already have access, but also there will be a political imperative. So what we need to do is build an infrastructure, and we're working with governments now. So we've launched in Goa, and we're working on this under the Clean Energy Ministerial, so it's completely outside the maritime sector, about how you build a global infrastructure for the transportation of fuels safely to feed other industries, recognizing that that also is going to provide an infrastructure for shipping. But it's going to be different, and it's not going to just be probably, ultimately it will evolve from being an east-west transit of fuels to a north-south, and that will change over time, and you will get losses and you will get advances, and there are some bonkers things being talked about, which we can go into for many hours. But there's a fantasy land about what's happening, and we need, as an industry, to understand what the reality is and build an opportunity, because as we've heard, the new fuels are less calorific in their value, so we're going to have to move more of it. So where we have a fleet of tankers in the world, if you meet the 1.5 degrees and you decarbonize the world, you're going to need an awful lot more tankers to move that, but it will be a different system. So we as an industry have always been very good at spotting opportunities and going for that. And that will then drive price down and will drive technology, which we can then utilize to a range of things. And then they will bring in CCS, because a carbon market is evolving. You see in Tradewinds, Lloyd's List, every publication, another carbon tanker being purchased. There's a different dynamic going on out there with other industries. So we need to stop just always thinking about ourselves, and we do have to do that. We have to think about ourselves and make sure we're representing our own industry in that space. But the other world isn't waiting for us either, and they have exactly the same challenges and worries. And the energy sector always worries that no one understands us. How does the power get out the wall? And we always say no one understands us. And every industry, and I've worked with multiple sectors all through my career, we all have the same challenges. So we need to understand what their challenges are, because we drive their transition as well. And what we can't be is the problem and the cork in the bottle, but we also can't move too quickly because we're interdependent. And those interdependencies which the military face or fail with, what we don't want to be is a failure point. We want to see an opportunity so we can move forward. Mike.
That's fascinating. I'm just hugely impressed by the work that the ICS has been doing in this particular space. Now, I think it started probably before Ukraine, or certainly the idea. So, what impact has what has been going on in the world had on the sort of the engagement that you necessarily have been seeking out? Has it proved a distraction, or has it just continued anyway?
I guess it's actually created proof of concept, because what we have seen with the move away, and Germany is a really interesting case in point, because in the energy space, they had a very high proportion of nuclear in their mix. And for political reasons, because the Green Party were having a very increasing rise in certain parts of Germany, Angela Merkel took a decision to pull out of nuclear in Germany, which ultimately meant more coal going up the Rhine. And they became more dependent to Russia through various pipeline existences. And then you've seen that switch. I remember talking to people saying, if you've got LNG in your fleet, start building more, because that's where you've seen energy security and that friendshoring and that whole mindset. And when we were doing these scenarios here in the energy space, we started out with what was called symphony and hard rock. Symphony being orchestrated world, the old Bretton Woods consensus, going through climate accords. We have Paris, everyone does what they're told. Then you had hard rock, which was a cost-optimized solution, which kind of bottom-up approach. But we were working through this, and that was our original, first starting point. And we tried to see where the evolution was, 3-year time horizon transition. And we saw this extra thing coming up called hard rock, and it's this nationalistic approach, and energy security being a priority. And we've seen that as a reaction to Ukraine, recognizing that the fragility to some extent in supply chains, in energy security, which trumps everything, and also I think the rise of the confidence of the Middle East and other parts of the world as well, because they're realizing that they're no longer a subservient society. As it talks to China, really, what they're saying is, the West have had it good for so long, why don't we have a piece of that? And they're no longer seeing themselves as subservient. They're equal partners in the world. And you sit down with Chinese government and understanding how they're working, that's their mindset. So I think Ukraine has, to some extent, created a proof of concept for that thinking of where we're going with working with others to build a global infrastructure for those new fuels, so that we're on the front foot. And obviously we do all the stuff around energy efficiency and the interrelationship, and I think you'll talk about that with URN and all those other things. But I think it's just making sure that we find our place as an industry in the way that the world is evolving, rather than just focusing ourselves on ourselves.